Okay, Ron Randall, thank
Hi.
you for joining us for Blastoff.
My pleasure.
So, okay, you have been you've been working in the industry for a long time,
I have.
and we just very quickly you mentioned about Joe Kubert's school, how you in the '70s you were a student there.
Right. It was in the second graduating class, so it was a brand new, embryonic organization when I attended it, but it was a great experience.
Who was in the class with you?
In the class with me were people like Tom Mandrake, who's done a lot of work for DC Comics over the years, and is still going strong at DC. Jen Duursema, who has done a ton of Star Wars comics for Dark Horse lately, and Kim DeMolder, who did a lot of inking for Marvel back in the day. People like that were in my class. We didn't have a lot of students in the class, but a fairly high percentage of us were able to get into the business and have kept careers going for a number of years.
Did you go to that school out of regular college?
I'd gone to college for 2 years here in Portland, Oregon, a liberal arts college, and was double majored in art and English, and was having a great time, loved the whole college atmosphere. But at the end of my sophomore year, I said, this is a great time. I'm writing short stories and poetry and doing drawings and paintings, and I'll get out of college in 2 years and I'll starve to death because I can't do anything for a living. And right at that time, I read some trade magazine about comics and stuff because I've always been into comics, and I saw there was an ad for the Kubert School, which I'd never heard of. It was brand new, and I said that might be my way into a job, or a career. So I applied through the mail. I sent the school a portfolio of stuff. Had a phone interview with Joe from 3,000 miles away, and got into the school that way. And the next thing I know, I'm standing in the middle of New Jersey, and I said, I must really want to do this because here I am. And yeah, it was a 2-year program at the time. The school was, so I went to that, and then gradually started, getting some short stories here and there. Mostly at DC, and a couple little things at Marvel Comics too.
So you stayed back east after you
Stayed back. I graduated and stayed back there for a total of 5 more years after I graduated. As I was, getting the career started. It was a time in the early '80s. There had been what they called the DC implosion, where the line had been very large and shrank down, and that happened. My timing was perfect because I started to try to get into the business right when it was shrinking. And of course, back then, this is before there was a direct sales market, before there were small independent publishers, sprinkling out all through the country. There was basically Marvel and DC Comics, and that was the industry. And there was Archie Comics too, a few little things, but it was all right there in Manhattan. So if Marvel and DC were shrinking and being very tight about the number of books they were putting out and who they were going to work with, you were watching the whole industry do that. So we had a few lean years, and the people I've mentioned, Tom Mandrake, Jen Duursema, Kim DeMolder, we were all in the same boat. We had all just been getting our feet in the door, so to speak, and then we found the little jobs hard to come by. So it was great having companions around, because you could commiserate, you could share your story. Oh yeah, that happened to me last week too. And then gradually one of us would get a job, and then another one. It just sort of thawed out or warmed up or whatever, and opened up after a little bit of time, and then we were able to find one job after another, and go it that way. So it was
It's fascinating hearing stories about this, because Len Wein and Mara Wolfman were both talking about their friendship, and they were talking about how they would go on tours in the DC offices, and they just started going on the tour every single day.
And eventually insinuated themselves into jobs.
Well, yeah, until at one point, Julie Schwartz said, will you please go get me a cup of coffee? Before they knew what they were interns.
Right.
But, the stories, like what you say is, all of you were coming up at the same time, and you
Right.
were all talking to each other about it, and you were all talking about a job that might be available, and maybe you were, giving leads to one another. I mean, it's a lot of that most people don't know.
Yeah, it's and they don't know, and now you can't know, because the entire atmosphere, the entire environment has changed. The way I don't know how you go about getting into the business these days, because I mean, I've heard different people have their different stories, but none of them sound anything like what I did, what I went through and experienced. So You know, just that the world changes, the landscape is changing all the time.
But your first published work was in the 70s, right?
Let me think about that. Yeah, the very tail end of the 70s, they did a few stories in the back of the Sergeant Rock book, basically because of Joe Kubert was the editor of that book. And a few of us, we were very fortunate. Of our graduating class, Joe sort of selected a few of us and invited us to, and he would give us these very short, like 3-page scripts from, usually by Bob Kanigher, Robert Kanigher, who is, you know, the classic Sergeant Rock writer, and just, you know, one of the pillars of DC Comics writing. And so he would have these very tiny stories, but they were rock solid. The structure was all there, and Joe would, right as we were graduating, Joe picked a few of us and gave us a few of these stories to draw that would appear in the back of the Sergeant Rock book. We didn't get paid very much for doing them, but the real pay was the way that we worked with Joe, because he would give us the script, we'd take it home, we'd do our thumbnails, we'd go to his house like in an evening or something, and he'd sit right there at his drawing board right next to us and go over the thumbnails, you know, one-on-one, sharing his thoughts. Oh, you could have drawn it this way or this way or this way, and it would have, for this reason, this reason, this reason. He was just, it was like, the 2 years at the school were really good years, but that, I call it like the third year. It was like, that was like the mentor apprentice program, and that was an incredible gift, because Joe, you know, he's just such a master of storytelling, and every shot I would come up with, he would come up with 4 off the top of his head that were 10 times better than the best thing I could come up with, and any one of them could have told the story. And one of the great things I learned from Joe is there isn't just one right panel, you know, depending on the panel that comes before the one that you're drawing, the panel comes after the one that you're drawing now, you know, some shots are going to work better and tell the story clearly, smoothly, and dramatically. So it was an amazing experience, a great learning experience. So anyway, I got a few short stories started that way, and then by sort of being slightly on the radar, I would be able to get a little something else from another editor, a short story here, a short story there. And that eventually led into a regular backup series in the Warlord book.
Warlord, of course I remember that.
And the first thing I did there was a science fiction series written by a good friend and a great writer named Gary Cohn, and it was called The Barren Earth. And it was a science fiction fantasy thing, sort of a cross between, I don't know, Dune and Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of stuff. People riding around on giant lizards and battling swampy fungus monsters, and it was for first crack out of the box. It was a pretty sweet gig.
You can't go wrong with a fungus monster.
No, you really can't. Yeah, and a sharp-looking gal with a sword, you know, an electrified sword and stuff like that, and a ray blaster in the other hand. It was pretty sweet stuff. So yeah, that was the first like regular gig that I got, and that led to stints on a lot of other DC books over the years.
Well, yeah, you were pretty prolific in the 80s. I mean, there was a lot of work.
Yeah. I did a stint on Arak, was the first you know, lead feature book that had. Helped out with some issues of Swamp Thing when Steve Bissett and John Tollivan were drawing that, and Alan Moore was writing them, of course. And I had stints on Warlord too. A little bit later on Justice League, I had a run on that. So yeah, I have had a long history with DC.
Well, but you did some Marvel too, like in the 90s. You were, is it Venom?
I did a Venom miniseries at Marvel, another series of like a secondary Spider-Man related character called Solo, and a few other things there as well. Helped out another Kubert School graduate, Tom Yates, was doing some work on the Universe X stuff, and so I pitched in and helped out a little bit of that. So yeah, I've had my intersections with Marvel come and go over the years too. Yeah.
Before I even get to the Trekker stuff, because I do want to get
right.
There's some things that we really are interested in with Blastoff, because we're about the history of comics, and you've been doing this a long time. You said comics obviously were a big part of your life. From when? From what age? What was it that was the first kind of, this was a comic that I picked up and it just got me?
Okay, well, you know, I can remember reading comics or having comics around as far back as I can remember. There were Mighty Mouse comics, and some Classics Illustrated. One of the first ones that sort of turned me on was a Classics Illustrated issue of Robin Hood, and he's on the cover, leaning around a tree, you know, aiming his arrow more or less right at the viewer. But the comic book that I have the clearest memory of opening up and looking and reading the story and saying, that's what I want to do, exactly that. And the thing that really, I'd say just really exploded my passion for it was an Al Williamson issue of Flash Gordon from Gold Key Comics that came out in like 1966 or something like that. And there was something about the combination of the exotic, romantic with a capital R sort of settings and the swampy worlds and aliens and the people looking so graceful and heroic, and there was an elegance and a grace to Al's drawings. It was an idealized world, but it had these crazy creatures and stuff going on, and I don't know, something about it just really was a bullseye for me.
Where did you get that comic?
I'm sure I got it at some little convenience store right here in Portland. Probably I was on a shopping trip, like with my mom. She was going out to pick up some things on an errand from the house, and I was brought along because I was just a little kid, you know. And usually what would happen then, she would, you know, I would amuse myself by browsing around in the comic racks or whatever while she was off doing, and buy this one, Mom? Okay. And I said, wow, it was really cool. It was unlike any comic I'd seen before that, in lots of ways. So.
And obviously your mom was okay with it. You know, a lot of people I talked to, their parents were remarkably unsupportive when it came to collecting comic books.
I pretty lucky about that with my parents. They, you know, I think they had a pretty good gauge of what would have been, you know, a self-destructive or an unhelpful or an unhealthy sort of activities, and pretty much anything else is fine. You know, just pursuing our own interests and stuff like that. My brother and I. So yeah, and you know, honestly, back then, this is a lot of years ago. I don't know what vintage of people you're talking about, but back when I was a kid reading comics, it would have been pretty hard to find a comic that would have been something that would have made adults uncomfortable to have a kid reading. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And these days, it's hard to find a comic that wouldn't make an adult feel uncomfortable watching their child reading it.
And did you collect then? Or did you just read and, you know, toss it aside like it was a newspaper?
Initially I collected them. I did collect them. Yeah, I didn't take good care of them. They're all dog-eared and they probably kill out. But I didn't throw any of them away. And then I met a friend early in grade school who I guess his dad had been into comics. Really loved the Carl Barks, Donald Duck comics and stuff. But he also knew about the different writers and artists in different books, and he had followed series and things. And that's when I got introduced to the idea of, oh, you can, you know, this is an actual thing. This collecting and cataloging and following certain writers and certain artists and certain books more passionately than others and stuff. So, but I knew, I've always felt, okay, I would like to be a creator of this sort of stuff, but I'm not really a collector. I don't have that sort of curator's mentality of, you know, filing things away carefully and cataloging them and keeping them in pristine condition and stuff. And of course you've got to have that if you really want to be a serious collector, because now more than it was back then, of course, things are just, there's a lot of money, and if you have the right books and they're well preserved.
Do you remember the first time you actually walked into a comic book store where you went, this is a store dedicated just
to comics? Well, let me think about that. I think it probably happened shortly after I'd moved back here to Portland, which would have been about 1985, and I went into a local comic shop here. And this is one of those, the way most of the comic book store, the first direct sales stores were, is like a converted used paperback bookstore, so it had that sort of, to me, sort of a magical, musty sort of smell, and you know, filter light through the dust of 20 years of decaying paperbacks or whatever was there. Yeah, it was, I mean, I knew a real sea change was happening right at the beginning of the 80s when the direct sales market happened. And there were some things that were exciting and good about it, especially if you were a creator, because you knew that the door was really opening up for a lot of different kinds of stories to be told in comic books in America than you had been able to tell earlier than that, unless you were working in the underground. But while over in Europe, they had taken the comic book, and instead of just keeping it as superheroes, they were telling westerns and crime stories, and all sorts of genres were being explored and treated in pretty mature fashion, and received that way from the public over there. But in America, and I think it's partially because comic books started in this country with Superman, you know, and then in the 60s you had Pal Sock Batman TV. I think that sort of cemented the idea of a comic book in the general public's mind as being a certain thing. Kid stuff, superheroes and kid stuff. And when the direct sales market came and the comic book companies were aware that you were going to get older people were going to be able to go and seek out comic books, people that knew about comic books and knew the history, that's around the time when a lot more sophistication came into things. It was right around also around the time that Alan Moore had just been changing the comic book world of writing with his work on Swamp Thing and other things. So I knew a big change was happening that was going to open up a lot of doors for us as creators. There was also the fear of no longer could a kid have, very easily anyway, the experience I had described to you that I had, where you're a little kid and you're tagging along with your mom and she buys a comic book store while she's buying the heads of lettuce just to keep you out of trouble. And that's how you became a comic book fan. I think that happened to a lot of people, comic book readers then. So finding the next generation of comic book readers it's a different dynamic now. It's a different challenge.
And for you, you said that you were writing a lot, and then you went to Joe Kubert School, and all of a sudden, you're an artist, and you're doing one thing, and you're doing another, and you're not. At that time, is your writing sort of disappearing? Are you doing it at home at night? Are you what?
Right. Well, what I say to people, to be a comic book artist, I'll talk sometimes to classrooms of kids, and I'll say, what do you think the most important thing to be a comic book artist is? And their hands are up, being able to draw really well, being able to draw people really well. I say, no. It's good to be able to draw well, but if I just wanted to draw well, I would be an illustrator. I'm a comic book artist because the thing that I like to do the most in comics, and what I think the job really is to be a storyteller. So when you ask what happened to my writing, well, what happened to the writing was I funneled it into collaborating with another writer, except that I'm using pictures in collaboration with their words to tell the story. So it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a storyteller, and I'd use words, and then I used pictures, and that's what comics are all about, as far as I'm concerned. That's the real magic of it, is that blending of those two things on the page. There's a lot that comics have in common with movies, words and images, but it's a different animal, and it's got its own kind of magic.
Can you think of a collaborator that you worked with that you felt you were most in sync with in that way?
Well, the one I mentioned, Gary Cohn, back in the very beginning, because we had really similar sensibilities, we were both really turned on by the same sort of, fantasy adventure, sci-fi swashbuckling sort of stuff. He was a great fellow to work with. Alan Moore, I was really lucky enough to be able to work on a few of his scripts on the Swamp Thing stuff, and Alan was able to so successfully communicate both his idea and his enthusiasm for his idea. And he would write a script, and I wish I'd saved some of his original scripts, because he would write a script in which, where you felt like you were engaged in a conversation with somebody who was telling you his idea for a story and inviting your input, not telling you how to do it, but saying, I think it could go like this, or like this, what do you think? And that was a rare experience too. Those are a couple. I've worked with, I really liked the run I did on Justice League. I was working with Jerry Jones, and we had a lot of phone conversations talking about both the story concept that Jerry would have, because Jerry's quite a thinker, and so we would work out some ideas of plot points there. It was mostly Jerry's stories, but he invited my input, and and then we'd talk about the different characters, and because the thing that I like the most usually in a story is the characters, the personalities, the interaction between characters, and the arc of the characters in the stories. So
do you enjoy, I mean, back at the beginning, there's, Warlord, it's really, here's a guy flying through a panel. You have Justice League, there's 10 guys flying through a panel.
It's a whole different animal. And I mean, when I took on the Justice League job, I had never drawn a team or a group book before, and I was really unprepared for it. All of a sudden, yeah, you're trying to find a way to sort of share the spotlight evenly amongst all these, stars of the book. And that's mostly a matter of obviously the writer has to block out the story the best they can, and then your job as the artist is just to work on the individual compositions of panels so that they can be designed as pleasingly as you can, and shift that focus around from character to character you're trying always to obey the needs of the story that the writer has given you. And so if he or she have done their job well, that focus can sort of shift smoothly. One or two characters get the spotlight now, and then others do. And that's whether it's a scene of dialogue or a scene of action. Yeah.
So you talked about when you were young and Al Williamson and seeing that sort of wondrous sort of thing. You talked about your passion for fantasy and sci-fi and swashbuckling. I think that leads us to Trekker.
Yeah, I think so too.
So this passion that you've had your whole life for that kind of storytelling, for people on our site that don't know about this but will and want to buy these old issues and things, when did it start? What was the seed of this book for you?
It started in 1985 when I just moved back from the East Coast here, and thinking I was moving 3,000 miles away from the comic book industry, because this is just as some of these, the direct sales market had come about, so small comic book companies were just starting up because they saw their opportunity for a different way to get their books into fans' hands. And Dark Horse Comics was one of those little startup companies at the time. And by then I'd had a track record of some years of working for, DC and Marvel. And so I was somebody that Dark Horse approached at a local convention here, and Randy Stradley came up and introduced himself to me and said he and his partner were starting a comic book company and were interested in me doing some work for them. So we started talking, and in the end, what they did was they sort of wrote a creative blank check for me, and they said, you can come and work for us and you can do whatever you want to, basically. And so then I had to sit down and think, well, what would that be? It was sort of like somebody calling your bluff in a way, or somebody asking you to, figure out exactly what your story would be. So I turned it over my head and went on some walks and thought, gee, if I really wanted to try to do this, what would I do? And most of the answers came pretty quickly as far as the genre, the type of story, and the style of telling. And so I just sort of came up with that list of the things that revved my engine the best, and put them together in a concept. And that was, instead started doing one of the fun parts of the job is sitting with a pencil and a sketchbook and just sort of letting it flow and see what sort of characters come out of the pencil. And that pretty quickly evolved into Trekker, my science fiction bounty hunter character.
And ran for how long?
I haven't really clocked it out. She started off in some issues of Dark Horse Presents for a few months, and then she got her own series, and that lasted for a year. And then she appeared in some more Dark Horse Presents stories and a couple of specials that have popped up in time from time to time, I guess is the best way to put it. It's a project that I, get back to, have in the past gotten back to periodically when I could, to tell another little bit of the tale here and there. But that's not a very satisfying way to do it. So I'm glad that I'm bringing it back in a more substantial and sustained way now.
And what is happening? What's the trajectory of...
Well, what's happening is, when I go to conventions, I'm always gratified that there's always some people that will come up to me, and they'll talk about one project that I worked on or another, or have me sign a book or do ask for a sketch. And one thing that people keep asking, when are you going to do more Trekker? And I sure like those Trekker stories. And it's gratifying when both men and women will come up and ask that, because it's a female lead book, started back in the 80s when people weren't doing that sort of thing. And so when women come up and say that they like the character and they like the presentation, I feel good about that, because, you know, if you're a guy writing and drawing female character comics, you're vulnerable to a certain amount of criticism, and fair enough. Anyway, so that's happened at conventions for many years now. So I know that it's a character that has stuck with some people, that's resonated with them, and that's really gratifying. And then about a couple of years ago, just the planets seemed to align in some ways. I was realizing that with the internet, I had a venue for doing something I've always wanted to do, and that is take all these sort of scattered, desperate appearances of Trekker and collect them in one place where people can find them easily. Because at a convention, if someone says, "Gee, I really like Trekker, and I've got these few issues, but how do I find the rest of them?" And I sometimes feel like I have to send somebody on a scavenger hunt, because it isn't easy to find them all in the back issue bins and stuff like that. So,
although you can find them on our site. So.
Good. That's great. Good for you. So that helps us solve that problem right there. But so the website, I'm collecting all the existing stories, and I'm having some of them newly colored by a colorist I found about a year and a half ago, and I said, that's how I'd like to have those stories colored, because most of the original Trekker stuff came out in black and white. Some of it was colored, but the color processes and options are so much greater now than they were even 10 years ago or something. That so I'm excited about that change as well.
And that will be on your website?
I have my own website, ronrandall.com, sure. But this is a site called trekkercomic.com, and that the website is to sort of reintroduce the character and sort of revive the whole thing. All the original art's been sitting in a closet of mine for the past 12 years or so, since her last print appearance, and it's time to do something about that. So it's doing that, and it's also the promise I've made to readers is that by the time I finish posting all the existing stories, I'm going to have new stories. So I've got the first of the new stories is drawn now and ready to go up there when the time is right.
To go up on the internet.
To go up on the internet, and at the same time, I'm also talking with Dark Horse about collecting the existing Trekker stories and putting that out as a one issue omnibus, one big omnibus book, and then printing the new stories, collecting those as well.
In periodical form?
Yeah, the plan is that they will come out in issues of Dark Horse Presents first, so serialized that way, then collected in individual volumes, and then expanded to trade paperbacks, and eventually, if things go well, there'll be like another omnibus too, I suppose. That's a little ways down the road, and taking it one step at a time, but.
And obviously, with you putting all your stuff on the net, you've embraced the. I keep saying the future, but it's not. It's the present.
It's the present, really. Yeah. I'd say it's more like I've just recognized the present for what it is, I suppose. Yeah. I still am a lover of print, and I like to do comics with pencil and paper, and I like to read comics that are printed on paper. But I don't see any reason not to have the whole world of websites and web comics sort of complement and help to support the print, and vice versa. So again, it's what I am as a storyteller, and that's the ultimate goal, is to tell a good tale.
It's fascinating because a creator like you, who worked so much in through the 80s and the 90s, a lot of work. There were a lot of comics.
Oh yeah.
In that time, a lot of that has never been collected and may never be collected, or they're collected in a form that went out of print and we'll never see it back in print again.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously for us, those are the things that making available to people. They can still read these 6 issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're not collected,
right?
But you can get the individual ones and read them all at once.
Yeah.
So you're sort of in that category of, there's a lot of your work that can only be read if you buy the comic. Right.
Yeah. And that's still the best way to read it too. As I said, my goal with the website is to raise some visibility, and I think that there was a readership for Trekker back in the 80s and through the early 90s, and there's a whole different landscape out there now, and a whole different potential audience, or an expanded potential audience, and I think the internet's a good way to help reach those people. But what I would hope people do would go to the website and see something they like there, and then say, now I want to have this, so I can have it on my bookshelf, and I can read it in, you know, the way it's intended to be read, ultimately, which to me is still in print.
Well, in that way, we're happy to be a collaborator with you too.
Well, it just I love the fluidity of what, you know, digital media can do, whether that's music or anything else, you know, comics included. But the substantial physical object there's something special about holding it in your hand.
That's great. Well, thank you for spending time with us. We really
Thanks.
appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right.